2 gunshots echoed in the memory of everyone who lived at Westbridge Apartments, but on that morning of March 15, 2024, the building was silent. By the time police reached apartment 4C at 2:47 a.m., the blood had already begun to dry on the kitchen floor, painting a story of violence that would shatter the myth of Lance O'Connor forever. What they found inside wasn't just a crime scene. It was the catastrophic ending of what had begun as a secret comfort between 2 lonely people and metastasized into something neither could control. The killer had been married for 17 years. The victim had been in America for 5 years, 4 of them illegal. Tonight, we're taking you inside one of the most disturbing cases of obsession and rage that crossed the invisible lines between hero worship and murderous possession. This isn't just another crime story. This is an examination of how easily we believe the uniform over the truth, how desperately the vulnerable will reach for salvation, and how a man who ran into burning buildings to save strangers became the monster who destroyed the woman he claimed to love. Her name was Ilona de Vera, and 18 months before she lay bleeding in that bathroom, fighting for a life that was already slipping away, she had been invisible. 29 years old, exhausted, undocumented, and utterly alone in a city that promised everything and delivered nothing but endless work for cash wages that disappeared the moment she wired them home to Cebu. Ilona wasn't supposed to matter in a city of 8 million stories. She was just another Filipina caregiver, one of thousands who keep the city's elderly alive, while their own lives remain suspended in a permanent state of waiting. But Ilona had learned early that waiting was survival. Born in Cebu City to a family that measured wealth in whether or not the electric bill got paid that month, she had watched her mother waste away from complications of diabetes that could have been managed with medication they couldn't afford. Her father had disappeared when she was 12, leaving behind 3 children and debts that multiplied like infections. Ilona, the eldest, took the weight without complaint. She always took the weight. She had made it through 2 years of nursing school before the money ran out completely. Her younger siblings needed school uniforms and books more than she needed a degree that would take years to pay off. So she did what thousands of Filipino women do when their country offers no future. She found an agency that promised American jobs, paid an exorbitant fee she'd be working off for years, and boarded a plane to New York City in 2019 with a tourist visa and a dream that was already half dead. The visa expired 6 months later. Ilona didn't. She simply disappeared into the invisible workforce, the army of caregivers who move through wealthy apartments like ghosts, touching lives without ever being seen as fully human. The agency connected her with families who needed help but preferred to pay in cash and ask no questions. Ilona moved from job to job, client to client, always one wrong word away from deportation. By December 2022, she had landed with Galina Volkov, a 78-year-old Russian immigrant who lived in a rent-stabilized 1-bedroom apartment that hadn't been updated since 1987. Galina's dementia came and went in waves. Some days she was sharp, telling stories of her youth in Moscow with perfect recall. Other days she didn't remember that her husband had been dead for 15 years and would spend hours waiting by the window for him to come home from work. Galina's daughter, Patricia, lived in California and managed her mother's care through video calls and wire transfers. She paid Ilona $600 a week, cash, no taxes, no paper trail. In exchange, Ilona lived in the spare room that had once belonged to Galina's son before he moved to Portland and stopped calling. The room was 10 feet by 12 feet, with no windows and a rollaway cot that left permanent indentations in Ilona's back. But it was hers, or as much hers as anything could be when you existed in the margins of legality. Ilona sent $800 home every month. It was mathematically impossible, but she made it work through a brutal calculus of denial. Skip meals, wear the same 3 outfits, never buy anything that wasn't absolutely necessary, and certainly never spend money on something as frivolous as entertainment or friendship. Her mother's medication cost $300 monthly. Her sister's university tuition took another $300. Her brother needed money for trade school. The math never worked, but Ilona made it work anyway, because that's what eldest daughters do in families where survival is a team sport. She attended Our Lady of Perpetual Hope, a predominantly Filipino church in a converted warehouse space, every Sunday that Galina's schedule allowed. She video called her family every Sunday evening, always with a smile, always with reassurances that everything was wonderful. She was healthy. She was saving money. She would come home soon for a visit. Every word was a lie, but they were lies that let her family sleep at night, and that felt like a kindness. Lance O'Connor, by contrast, had never been invisible a single day in his adult life. At 38, he was exactly what Central Casting would send if you requested heroic firefighter. 6'2", broad-shouldered, strong-jawed, with the kind of face that photographs well and the kind of presence that makes people automatically step aside. He had been born in Irongate, raised in Irongate, and would almost certainly die in Irongate, because men like Lance don't leave neighborhoods where everyone knows their name and their legacy. His father, Captain Dennis O'Connor, had been a 9/11 first responder, one of the ones who'd raced toward the towers while the world ran away. Dennis had survived that day but died slowly over the next 18 years, his lungs destroyed by the toxic dust he'd inhaled while pulling bodies from the rubble. He'd been at every community event, every charity fundraiser, every moment where Irongate needed a hero. When he finally died in 2019, the funeral procession stretched for 12 blocks, and the mayor gave a eulogy that made grown firefighters weep. Lance had grown up in that shadow, and it was a shadow that demanded perfection. Dennis O'Connor's son didn't get to be mediocre. He didn't get to be just okay. He had to be exceptional, had to be worthy of the name, had to prove that heroism was genetic and could be passed down like eye color or a tendency toward addiction. Lance had spent his entire childhood trying to earn a pride from his father that was always just slightly out of reach, always contingent on the next accomplishment, the next rescue, the next moment of valor. He'd married Meredith Harper right out of high school, back when she was dating a boyfriend who left bruises, and Lance was the knight who rescued her. She'd loved him desperately in those early years, the way people love their saviors. They'd had Connor when Lance was 27, Emma 3 years later. The marriage had been good once, or at least Lance remembered it as good, though Meredith might tell a different story if anyone bothered to ask her. By 2022, the marriage was a performance they both maintained for the sake of the children and the neighborhood's expectations. They had dinner together. They showed up to school events together. They posted family photos on social media with captions about being blessed. But they hadn't had sex in 8 months, hadn't had a genuine conversation in longer, and hadn't actually liked each other in so long that neither could pinpoint when the affection had curdled into resignation. Lance drank. Not obviously, not publicly, but steadily and increasingly. A flask in his locker at the firehouse. Beers in the garage that he told himself were normal. Whiskey in his coffee on rough mornings. Meredith knew and said nothing because saying something would mean confronting how broken everything had become, and confrontation felt more exhausting than simply existing in the decay. Then came October 12, 2022, and the fire at Riverside tenement building that would change everything. It was a 5-alarm blaze, the kind that brings every truck in the borough and half the news cameras in the city. Families trapped on upper floors. Smoke so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Heat that melted the paint off doors before you could touch them. Lance went in 3 times. First for a family of 4 huddled in a bathroom. Second for an elderly man who'd collapsed in the hallway. Third for 2 children whose mother had thrown them into the arms of firefighters before the floor collapsed beneath her. The news cameras caught Lance emerging from the smoke, carrying a 6-year-old girl in his arms, her face buried against his neck. The photo went viral within hours. Hero firefighter risks life to save 4. The headline screamed, and suddenly Lance O'Connor wasn't just Dennis's son anymore. He was a hero in his own right. The mayor gave him a commendation. The neighborhood threw him a celebration. His Instagram following exploded overnight, suddenly full of strangers calling him a hero, telling him he was what America needed, thanking him for his service. Lance told himself he was humble about the attention, but he checked his phone constantly, refreshing to see new comments, new praise, new confirmation that he was special. What he didn't tell anyone was that the validation felt like oxygen. For the first time in his life, he wasn't being compared to his father. He wasn't Dennis O'Connor's son. He was Lance O'Connor, hero, and he was utterly, desperately addicted to the feeling. But heroism is performative, and performances require an audience. At home, Meredith had stopped being impressed by his exploits years ago. She'd ask him to take out the trash, and he'd snap that he'd just saved 4 lives. Couldn't she handle basic household tasks? She'd mention that Connor's grades were slipping, and he'd accuse her of not appreciating how hard he worked. The distance between them widened with each interaction, until they were 2 people sharing a house and nothing else. 3 weeks after the fire, Lance was at his sister Katie's apartment, helping her fix a leaking radiator because that's what heroes do. They help. Katie lived at Westbridge Apartments, same building complex where her friend Galena lived. Katie mentioned that Galina's caregiver was struggling with a broken radiator that the superintendent kept ignoring. Lance offered to take a look because fixing things for strangers was easier than fixing what was broken in his own life. December 18, 2022, 3:30 p.m. Lance knocked on apartment 4C with his toolbox and his hero's smile, expecting to spend 20 minutes fixing a radiator and adding another small good deed to his mental ledger. Alona answered the door in scrubs that had been washed so many times they were more gray than blue, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, exhaustion carved into the lines around her eyes. She looked at him the way people look at firefighters, with automatic respect, with gratitude, with the assumption that someone in uniform must be good. Lance was used to that look. He collected those looks like other men collected stamps. But there was something different in Alona's gaze, something that made him stand up a little straighter, made him want to be the hero she was seeing. He fixed the radiator in 15 minutes. It was a simple job, just needed bleeding and a tightened valve. But he stretched it to 45 minutes, making conversation while he worked, asking Alona about herself in a way that felt like genuine interest because, in that moment she told him about Galina, about her work, carefully editing out the parts about her visa status but leaving in enough that Lance could read between the lines. She was alone here. She was working for cash. She was the kind of vulnerable that made certain men see opportunity and made Lance see someone who needed rescuing. Before he left, Lance gave her his business card. O'Connor Handyman Services. No job too small. He told her to call if anything else broke, that the first visit was free for Katie's neighbors, that he was always around if she needed help. Alona took the card and pinned it to Galina's refrigerator, not thinking much about it beyond relief that she had a contact for household emergencies that wouldn't require explaining her situation to a superintendent who might ask too many questions. Lance thought about her for 3 weeks straight. Not constantly, not obsessively, just regularly. He'd be driving home from a shift and remember the way she'd smiled when the radiator started producing heat again. He'd be scrolling through Instagram, reading comments about how amazing he was, and think about how Alona had looked at him like he was actually amazing and not just performing amazement. He'd be lying in bed next to Meredith's silent, turned-away body and wonder what it would feel like to be with someone who still looked at him the way Alona had. February 8, 2023. Galina fell in the bathroom, hit her head on the tub, and Alona panicked in a way that transcended language and logic. She couldn't call 911 because ambulances brought paperwork and paperwork brought questions and questions brought ICE agents and deportation and the end of everything she'd built. She couldn't call Galina's daughter because Patricia would fire her for negligence. She couldn't call anyone from church because it was 9:30 p.m. and dragging someone else into her illegal work situation felt like spreading a disease. She remembered Lance's card. She called the number with shaking hands, expecting voicemail, getting a live answer on the second ring. O'Connor Handyman, he'd said, and Alona had sobbed into the phone. I need help, please. I don't know who else to call. Lance arrived in 15 minutes, breaking multiple traffic laws and making it feel like an emergency response because emergencies made him feel alive in ways that normal life never did. He found Alona crying in the hallway, too afraid to leave Galina alone but too terrified to go back in. He took charge immediately, checked Galina's pupils, stabilized her neck with towels, made the decision that no hospital was needed but watch her overnight. He was calm, competent, heroic, everything Alona needed him to be in that moment. After Galina was settled and sleeping, Lance sat with Alona at the kitchen table while she cried with relief and told him things she'd never told anyone. About her visa, about her family, about how she sent home more money than she made and survived on hope and rice and the belief that suffering now would mean security later. Lance listened with what felt like genuine compassion because, in that moment, it was genuine. Here was someone who actually needed him, not for photo ops or social media clout, but for real, tangible help. He gave her his personal cell phone number. Not the work number. Call me directly if you need anything, even just to talk. He hugged her goodbye, and it lasted 3 seconds too long, his hand on the small of her back in a way that wasn't quite professional but wasn't quite sexual either. It was intimate. It was a promise. It was the first step across a line neither of them acknowledged they were crossing. The text messages started the next day. Casual at first. How's Galina's head? Still monitoring, thank you again. That's what friends do. But within a week, the messages had shifted into something else. Good morning text, photos of food, complaints about work, late-night conversations when both of them should have been sleeping but couldn't because loneliness is a special kind of insomnia. Lance started positioning himself as the only person who understood Alona. He'd text things like, "You ever feel invisible to everyone around you?" And she'd respond every single day, and they'd both feel like they'd found someone who finally saw them. He'd share complaints about his marriage, carefully framed as "my wife and I grew apart," rather than "I'm emotionally cheating." Alona would share her fears about immigration, about money, about never being enough for everyone who needed her. March 22, 2023. Galina's daughter gave Alona an unexpected afternoon off, and Alona texted Lance without overthinking it. "I have free time today. Is that park offer still open?" Lance had mentioned Irongate Waterfront Park in passing weeks ago, said she should see the sunset there, said he'd show her if she ever had time. He'd been at the firehouse when her text arrived, told his crew he had errands, and met her at the park within an hour. They walked for 3 hours. Lance played tour guide, showing her the neighborhood he'd grown up in, telling stories that made her laugh, making her feel like she was part of something instead of always outside looking in. He bought her ice cream from a vendor. She taught him a Tagalog phrase. They sat on a bench watching boats on the water, and their shoulders touched in that plausibly deniable way that people who are pretending not to be attracted to each other always manage. Lance told her something that felt vulnerable, but was actually manipulation wrapped in honesty. "I don't think I'm actually a good person. I think I'm just good at looking like one." Alona, desperate to believe that someone successful and admired could be as lonely as she was, responded with exactly what he needed to hear. "I think you're better than you believe." He almost kissed her. Would have, except her phone rang. Patricia calling with a question about Galina's medication, and the moment shattered. They said awkward goodbyes, both claiming they should do this again sometime, while knowing that this had already become something neither could name, but both felt pulling them forward. That night, Lance texted, "I had a really great time today. You make me feel like myself again." Alona stared at the message for an hour, war between what she knew was right and what she desperately wanted. She finally responded, "Me too." They both knew exactly what they just admitted. Neither was ready to acknowledge it. For the next 3 weeks, they maintained the fiction that they were just friends. Coffee meetups that Lance claimed were helping her learn the city. Phone calls that Alona justified as, "He's the only person who checks on me." But the escalation was inevitable, visible to anyone who bothered to look, which nobody did because Lance was a hero and Alona was invisible, and the space between hero and invisible was where affairs were born. April 10, 2023. Galina was at adult daycare, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., the only time Alona had the apartment to herself. Lance texted, "I'm off today. Can I come fix that loose cabinet you mentioned?" There was no loose cabinet. They both knew it. Alona still responded, "Okay, come at 2. Lance arrived with a toolbox he didn't need and intentions he wouldn't admit to himself. They made small talk for exactly 4 minutes before the pretense became unbearable. Lance said, "You know why I keep coming back here, right?" And Alona said, "Please don't say it." And Lance said it anyway, "I can't stop thinking about you." Alona tried to protest. "This is wrong. You have a family. I have nothing to offer you." But Lance had been rehearsing his lines for weeks. "You offer me something no one else can. You see me. The real me." It was a lie and a truth simultaneously. She saw a version of him he wanted to exist, which wasn't the same as seeing him truly, but felt close enough. The kiss happened in the kitchen, desperate and clumsy, and exactly what 2 lonely people who'd been circling each other for months would create. They ended up in Alona's tiny room, on her rollaway cot that creaked with every movement, having sex that was more about need than pleasure, about proving they could cross this line as much as wanting to. Afterward, Alona cried. Lance held her and said all the things men say when they want to justify betrayal. "We didn't do anything wrong. My marriage was over long before this. I'm going to leave her. I'll get divorced, marry you, fix your papers. We can build something real." Alona wanted to believe him so desperately that she ignored every warning sign her brain was screaming. She ignored that he still wore his wedding ring. Ignored that he'd never mentioned divorce before today. Ignored that promises made in post-sex vulnerability are worth less than the breath they're spoken with. She ignored it all because the alternative was admitting she just destroyed another woman's marriage for a fantasy that would never materialize. Lance left at 3:45 p.m., 15 minutes before Galina's transport would return her. He drove home, kissed his wife on the cheek, played with his kids, and texted Alona, "I love you," from his bathroom while Meredith made dinner downstairs. Alona texted back, "I think I love you too," and tried to believe that love justified what they'd done. Neither of them understood yet that what they'd created wasn't love. It was need masquerading as love, loneliness wearing love's costume, obsession using love's vocabulary. But obsession always reveals itself eventually. And when it did, the blood on the bathroom floor would tell the only truth that mattered. Lance O'Connor was no hero. He was just a man who'd convinced everyone, including himself, that the uniform made him better than the violence he was always capable of. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons became sacred to them in the way that stolen time always becomes sacred to people who are lying to everyone including themselves. Galena would leave at 8:45 a.m. in the transport van, and Lance would arrive by 9:15 with some household item that needed fixing. A door hinge, a cabinet handle, a light switch that worked perfectly fine. They'd have sex first, urgent and necessary, in Alona's narrow room where the walls were thin enough to hear Mrs. Chen's television through the plaster. Afterward, they'd lie tangled in sheets that smelled like desperation and talk about futures they were never going to build. Lance always left by 3:30 p.m., giving himself buffer time before Galena's 4 p.m. return. He'd kiss Alona goodbye like he was leaving for war instead of driving 15 minutes back to a life he claimed to hate but refused to leave. "Soon," he'd say. "Just a few more months and I'll file for divorce. I'm working on it." Alona would nod and smile and ignore the fact that working on it never included concrete steps like consulting lawyers or having actual conversations with his wife. By late April, the affair had settled into a pattern that felt almost normal, which is when affairs become most dangerous. When the adrenaline fades and what's left is just two people trying to build a relationship on a foundation of lies and timestamped text messages. Lance started buying Alona gifts, perfume that cost more than she made in a week, jewelry she couldn't wear outside the apartment because how would she explain it, a new phone with unlimited data because, "I want to see your face when we talk." The phone came with a condition she didn't understand at first. He'd set it up for her, installed all the apps, linked it to her email. What she didn't realize was that he'd also installed a tracking app that fed her location directly to his phone. Lance told himself it was for her safety. She was undocumented, alone, vulnerable. But he checked it constantly. At the firehouse during meals. At home when Meredith was in the shower. At 2 a.m. when he couldn't sleep and needed to confirm that Alona was where she said she was. The first explosion came on May 23rd. Alona's phone had died during the afternoon, battery drained from too many video calls to her family in Cebu. She'd plugged it in and forgotten about it, spending 3 peaceful hours without the constant buzz of Lance's texts demanding updates on what she was doing, who she was with, why she wasn't responding fast enough. Lance had texted 17 times, called 11, each message escalating from, "Hey, you okay?" to, "Where are you?" to, "Why aren't you answering?" to, "I know you're there. Who are you with?" By the time Alona finally saw the messages at 8 p.m., Lance was already drunk and driving to Westbridge Apartments, convinced she was cheating on him with someone, though who that someone could be when she literally never left the building except for church was a question his paranoia didn't bother answering. He pounded on the door at 10:15 p.m., loud enough to wake Galena, loud enough to bring Mrs. Chun into the hallway asking if everything was okay. Alona opened the door in her sleeping clothes, terrified and confused, trying to pull Lance inside before he woke the entire floor. "What are you doing? You can't be here at night." Lance pushed past her, reeking of whiskey, eyes wild with a rage that had been building all evening. "Where were you? Why weren't you answering me? My phone died. Look, it's right there charging. I was here all day with Galena. Nobody else." But Lance was already searching the apartment like a detective at a crime scene, opening closets, checking the bathroom, looking for evidence of a man who didn't exist. Galena wandered out in her nightgown, dementia making her confused and frightened. "Who are you? What are you doing in my house?" Lance ignored her. His entire focus was on Alona, on confirming his paranoid fantasy. "That physical therapist who comes on Wednesdays. I see how he looks at you. He's 60 years old and married, Lance. And he comes for Galena, not me. You're lying. I can always tell when you're lying." It was the first time Alona saw clearly what Lance was. Not a hero who loved her, but a controller who needed her. The distinction mattered. Love meant caring about her well-being. Control meant caring only about possession. She'd spent 3 months confusing the two. But standing in her kitchen at 10:30 p.m. with Galina crying and Lance accusing her of infidelities she couldn't physically commit, the difference became undeniable. "I gave up everything for you," Lance said, which was his favorite lie. He'd given up nothing. He still went home every night to his wife and kids, still posted family photos on Instagram with captions about being blessed, still wore his wedding ring because taking it off would require explaining where it went. "You haven't given up anything." Alona's voice was louder than she'd ever let it be with him. "You're still married. You still live in your house. You haven't even told your wife about me." The truth cornered Lance in a way his paranoia couldn't escape. So he did what controllers do when their narrative gets challenged. He threatened, "You know what I could do? I could call immigration right now. One phone call and you're on a plane back to Manila." The words hung in the kitchen like smoke. Alona stared at him, watching the man she'd thought she loved transform into someone she didn't recognize. Or worse, someone she was finally recognizing. "You would do that? After everything?" Lance immediately tried to backtrack, his anger shifting into the apology phase of the abuse cycle he didn't know he was performing. "No, baby, I didn't mean it. I was just scared. I thought I was losing you. You know, I'd never actually do that. But he would." Alona understood that now. The threat wasn't hypothetical. It was a weapon he'd been holding the entire time, and now she knew it existed. The affair had changed. What had started as mutual loneliness had curdled into something toxic. Lance needed her to need him, and when she'd stopped looking at him like a hero, he'd decided fear was an acceptable substitute for admiration. They had sex that night because Alona didn't know how to say no when saying no might trigger his rage again. Lance took it as reconciliation. Alona experienced it as violation with consent, the kind of encounter that leaves you showering for 40 minutes and still feeling dirty. Afterward, Lance held her and whispered promises about their future, and Alona said nothing because speaking would mean admitting she was trapped. June 15, 2023. Alona's period was 3 weeks late. She'd been nauseous for days, exhausted beyond the normal caregiver fatigue, crying at commercials and Korean dramas for no reason. She knew before she took the test. Her body had been screaming the truth at her, but her brain had been refusing to listen because pregnancy wasn't part of the fantasy, wasn't something they'd planned, wasn't anything except a disaster. She took the test at 7 a.m. while Galina was still sleeping, watched the 2 lines appear with a speed that felt cruel. Positive. Definitely, undeniably, catastrophically positive. Alona sat on the closed toilet lid for 20 minutes, staring at the test, running calculations that didn't work. She had no money, no papers, no home that was actually hers, no health insurance, no legal right to be in this country, no way to raise a child while working 80 hours a week caring for someone else's mother. But also, Catholic upbringing that made abortion feel impossible. And something else, something she couldn't name but felt deeply. This was hers. Lance had taken so much. Her peace, her self-respect, her sense of safety. But this baby was hers. He couldn't control it, couldn't manipulate it, couldn't threaten to call ICE on it. It was hers. She told Lance that evening when he showed up for their usual Tuesday afternoon that had bled into evening because he'd texted claiming he needed to see her. She led with the facts, no emotion, just information. "I'm pregnant." Lance's face cycled through reactions in 5 seconds. Shock, panic, anger, calculation. The calculation was what terrified her. She could see him running numbers, assessing damage, planning responses. When he finally spoke, his first question was blame. "How did this happen?" "These things happen. Birth control isn't perfect. You said you were being careful." "I was. We both were. It happened anyway." Long silence. Lance standing in the middle of the kitchen, hands in his hair, breathing hard like he'd just run 5 miles. Finally, "This changes everything." Alona tried to reach for the fantasy they'd been building. "I know it's scary, but maybe it's a sign. You said you wanted to leave your wife." "I said eventually. Not now. Not like this. So what do you want me to do?" Lance looked at her like she was stupid for not understanding. "You know what you need to do. Say it. You need to take care of this. Get rid of it." "No." The word came out stronger than Alona knew she was capable of. "I'm not doing that." "Alona, be reasonable. You can't have this baby. You have no money, no papers, no home. How are you going to raise a child?" "I have you. You promised you'd take care of me." "I will." But not with a baby. That complicates everything. My divorce, your status, everything. You need to be smart about this. Smart. Alona's voice was rising. Smart would have been not sleeping with a married man. But we're past smart. This is where we are. Lance shifted tactics. Think about the baby. What kind of life can you give it? You're illegal. You work for cash. The moment you give birth in a hospital, they'll ask questions. ICE will come. You'll get deported and the baby will end up in the system. Is that what you want? It was manipulation dressed as concern, and Alona almost fell for it. But something in her had hardened during those 3 weeks of missed period. Those mornings of vomiting into Galina's toilet. Those nights of lying awake calculating impossible futures. She'd been powerless her entire life. Her family's poverty had been powerless. Her undocumented status made her powerless. Her affair with Lance had made her powerless. But this baby was power. It was the one thing in her life that was truly hers, and she wasn't giving it up for a man who'd never left his wife and never would. Get out, she said. Alona, get out. I need to think. Don't do something stupid because you're emotional. The only stupid thing I did was believe you actually loved me. Leave. Now. Lance left, but his parting words carried a weight that felt like prophecy. Think very carefully about what you're doing. You're making this harder than it needs to be. For the next 2 weeks, Lance launched a campaign that oscillated between pressure and sweetness, threat and promise. He'd send money via Venmo with notes like, for the procedure, please. Alona would send it back. He'd show up at the building, wait outside until she had to take Galina to a doctor's appointment, accidentally run into them on the street. He'd follow them to the clinic, wait outside, follow them home. Alona told Maricel everything during a tearful confession at church. Maricel, who'd been a caregiver for 15 years and had seen every variation of employer abuse and boyfriend manipulation, looked at Alona with eyes that held more sadness than anger. You need to leave him. He's dangerous. Where would I go? I have nothing. You have us, the community. You think you're the first Filipina to end up pregnant by a man who promised everything and delivered nothing? You stay with me until you figure it out. But Alona couldn't leave. Not the job. Not the apartment. Not even Lance, as much as she was starting to fear him, because fear and attachment aren't opposites. They're neighbors, sometimes roommates. She'd invested too much. Endured too much. Believed too much. Walking away meant admitting it had all been for nothing, and her pride couldn't survive that admission. By July, Lance's behavior had deteriorated in ways visible to everyone except the people who worshipped him. At the firehouse, he was drinking openly, flask visible in his locker. Captain Rodriguez pulled him aside. You're not yourself. Take some leave. Figure out whatever's going on. Lance was placed on forced leave starting July 20th, which meant more free time, more drinking, more driving past Westbridge apartments at random hours. Alona, now 8 weeks pregnant and showing slightly, asked the building superintendent to not let Lance up anymore. The superintendent, a retired cop named Martinez who'd seen enough domestic situations to recognize the pattern, asked if she wanted police involved. Alona said no, couldn't risk the questions, but please, just don't let him in the building. Lance found out through Katie, his sister, who mentioned it casually, thinking Lance and Alona had just had a normal breakup. He texted Alona, "You're turning people against me? That's how you want to play this?" Alona didn't respond. She'd learned that responding fed him, gave him entry points, kept the connection alive. Silence was the only defense she had, and even that felt inadequate. August 8th, 11 p.m. Lance had been drinking since 2 p.m., sitting in his car outside Westbridge Apartments, watching Alona's window, constructing scenarios in his head where she was with someone else, where she was laughing about him, where she was planning to destroy his life. The paranoia had become its own entity, feeding on alcohol and rejection and the crumbling of his carefully maintained public image. He used a key he'd made months ago, back when the affair was new and they'd pretended he needed emergency access to fix things. He let himself into the apartment at 11:30 p.m., quiet enough not to wake Galina, loud enough that Alona heard the door open and came out of her room in her sleeping clothes, freezing when she saw him. "You can't be here." Her voice was a whisper, trying not to wake Galina but unable to hide the terror. "Who's here? Where is he?" Lance was slurring, swaying, looking around her small apartment like he'd find a lover hiding in the closet. "No one's here. You're drunk. You need to leave." But Lance was already searching, opening doors, checking the bathroom, looking under Galina's bed where the old woman slept fitfully, confused by the commotion. When he found nothing, instead of being relieved, Lance became more agitated. The absence of evidence didn't disprove his paranoia. It just meant Alona was better at hiding things than he'd thought. Galina woke up, came out in her nightgown, saw a strange man in her apartment and started shouting, "Who are you? Get out. Alona, call the police." Lance tried to calm her, which only scared her more. Alona was trying to guide Galina back to bed while also trying to get Lance out, both tasks impossible while Lance was demanding to know where Alona had been all day, who she'd been with, why she wouldn't answer his calls. In the chaos, Galina stumbled, fell, hit her head on the coffee table corner. The sound was sickening, bone on wood, sharp and final. She didn't lose consciousness, but blood immediately started running down her face, and Galina's confusion turned to panic, and Alona was screaming, and Lance was suddenly sober with the clarity of horror at what he'd caused. She fell. I didn't push her. Alona was already on the phone with 911, giving the address, saying there'd been an accident, needing an ambulance now. Lance ran, took the stairs 2 at a time, left through the service entrance, drove home with blood on his shirt, Galina's blood from when he tried to help her, tried to stop the bleeding, tried to undo what his presence had caused. The paramedics took Galina to Irongate General Hospital. Minor concussion, 6 stitches, observation overnight. Alona told them Galina had fallen, made no mention of Lance, still protecting him despite everything. Because the alternative was explaining why a married firefighter had been in her apartment at 11:30 at night, and that explanation led to questions she couldn't answer without destroying what little stability she had left. But she took photos of the bruises on her arms where Lance had grabbed her, documented the damage for the first time, started building evidence she didn't yet know she'd need. September 14, 2023, started as an ordinary Thursday except for the way Lance couldn't stop shaking. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, the kind of sleeplessness that comes from a brain that won't stop calculating consequences and outcomes and the systematic destruction of everything he'd built. Meredith had stopped asking questions weeks ago, had moved into the guest room, had started making calls to divorce attorneys she thought Lance didn't know about. His children looked at him like he was a stranger. The firehouse had made it clear his leave wasn't coming to an end. There would be investigations, evaluations, possibly termination. He'd lost everything except the fantasy that he could still control Alona, still fix this, still salvage something from the wreckage. That fantasy was the only thing keeping him from driving his car into a bridge pylon, and he clung to it with the desperation of a drowning man clinging to debris. He'd been parked outside the Irongate Community Health Center since 1 p.m., watching the entrance, waiting. He knew Alona had a prenatal appointment at 2:30. He'd been tracking her phone, had memorized her schedule, had become the thing that restraining orders are written about, except there was no restraining order because Alona couldn't file one without exposing her status. At 3:45 p.m., Alona emerged from the clinic, and Lance could see it. The small but undeniable curve of her stomach under her loose dress, the pregnancy that was becoming real and visible and impossible to deny. 14 weeks, his child, his responsibility, his potential destruction. She was keeping it. She was really keeping it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He sat in his car watching her walk to the bus stop, and something in his brain that had been holding together with duct tape and denial finally snapped. Not dramatically, not with rage, just a quiet acceptance that this couldn't continue, that something had to end, that he was out of options for controlling the situation. He spent that evening in his basement, not thinking, just sitting in the dark with a bottle of whiskey and a hunting knife he'd bought years ago for camping trips he'd never taken. He wasn't planning anything. At least, that's what he told himself. He was just sitting, just drinking, just existing in the space between his old life and whatever came next. But he cleaned the knife, put it in his messenger bag, told himself it was for protection, though protection from what, he couldn't articulate. September 15th, 6 a.m. Lance woke up on the basement couch, neck stiff, head pounding, mouth tasting like metal and regret. Upstairs, he could hear Meredith making breakfast for the kids, the sounds of a family that was functioning without him. He waited until they left, Meredith to work, kids to school, before going upstairs to shower. He looked at himself in the mirror and didn't recognize the face looking back. When had he become this? When had the hero everyone celebrated become the monster who threatened pregnant women and broke into apartments and drank himself unconscious in basements? He couldn't pinpoint the moment. Maybe there wasn't one moment. Maybe it was accumulation, 1,000 small choices that felt justified individually but added up to someone unrecognizable. He told Meredith he was going to an AA meeting. She didn't believe him, hadn't believed anything he'd said in months, but she was too tired to argue. He took his messenger bag with the knife inside, still telling himself he didn't know why, that he wasn't planning anything, that he just needed to talk to Alona, make her understand, fix this before it became unfixable. He arrived at Westbridge Apartments at 7:30 a.m., parked in his usual spot across the street, watched Galina's transport van arrive at 8:45, watched the aide help Galina into the van, watched Alona wave goodbye from the doorway, her pregnant stomach visible now even from a distance, watched her go back inside, alone. The apartment would be empty until 4 p.m., 7 hours, plenty of time to talk, to reason, to make her see that keeping this baby was insane, that she was destroying both their lives, that the smart choice, the only choice, was to end this pregnancy and end this relationship and let them both move on. He entered the building at 9 a.m., using the door code he'd memorized months ago. Took the stairs instead of the elevator because somewhere in his lizard brain he knew that cameras were enemies, that he needed to minimize digital footprints, that what he was about to do required invisibility. He stood outside apartment 4C for 10 full minutes, rehearsing opening lines. "I'm sorry for scaring you. I just need to talk. We can work this out. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to help us both." The words felt reasonable in his head, like he was actually the rational one, like Alona was being hysterical and he was bringing calm adult logic to solve their problem. He knocked, soft at first, then harder when she didn't answer. He knew she was in there. He could hear movement, could hear her phone playing music, could sense her presence through the door. "Alona, I know you're there. Please, 5 minutes, just talk to me." Her voice came through the door, small and scared. "Go away, Lance. I have nothing to say to you. I'm not leaving until you talk to me. I'll stand here all day if I have to. Then stand there. I'm not opening this door." 2 hours passed. Lance sitting against the door, alternating between pleading and threatening, between, "I love you, please," and, "You can't keep doing this to me." Alona inside, phone in hand, debating whether to call Maricel, call the police, call anyone. But calling meant exposure, meant questions, meant potential deportation, meant losing everything including the baby. At 10:45 a.m., Lance's patience, soaked in alcohol and desperation, dissolved completely. He stood up, took 3 steps back, and kicked the door. The lock was cheap, installed in the 1980s and never upgraded. It took 4 kicks before the frame splintered and the door swung open. Alona screamed, ran to her bedroom, slammed that door, locked it. Lance was inside the apartment now, point of no return crossed, breathing hard, looking at what he'd done. The broken door, the violated space, the terror he'd caused, and instead of stopping, instead of recognizing he'd become the monster, he justified it. She'd forced him to this. If she'd just talked to him reasonably, he wouldn't have had to break in. "Alona, I'm not here to hurt you. Just come out and talk to me." Inside her room, Alona called 911 with shaking hands, whispered the address. "Someone broke into my apartment. Please send help." Hung up before the dispatcher could ask follow-up questions that would expose too much. Lance heard her voice through the door, realized police were coming, felt the walls closing in. He had maybe 5 minutes before sirens arrived. 5 minutes to convince her to send them away, to tell them it was a mistake, to salvage this. "Alona, you called the cops? Are you serious? Do you know what happens when they get here? They're going to ask for your ID. They're going to find out you're illegal. You're going to get deported and I'm going to get arrested and we both lose. Is that what you want?" The logic was sound in his fractured thinking. They were enemies to each other now, but they were also accomplices. Her crime was existing illegally. His crime was breaking and entering. If police arrived, both their secrets would explode. Mutually assured destruction. The knocking on the apartment door interrupted his spiral. Not police, they'd be banging, shouting, using authority voices. This was softer. "Mrs. Volkov? Are you home? It's Maria." Galina's transport van had returned early. Galina had gotten dizzy at the daycare center. Nothing serious, but policy required they bring her home. Maria, the aide, had helped Galina to the door and found it broken, hanging open, voices shouting inside. "Mrs. Volkov, we should wait outside. I'll call the building manager." But Galina, locked in dementia's twisted logic, pushed past Maria. "This is my home. I'm going in." Galina entered the apartment and saw Lance standing in the middle of her living room, a stranger in her space, her door broken behind him. "Who are you? Why is my door broken?" She didn't remember him from the incident 3 weeks ago. The dementia had erased that night completely. Alona heard Galina's voice, unlocked her bedroom door, came out to protect the old woman who'd become the closest thing to family she had in this country. "Galina, it's okay. Come with me. Maria, please take her to your apartment." Lance just stood there, frozen, watching his last chance at controlling the narrative slip away as witnesses multiplied. Maria hovering in the doorway, uncertain. Galina confused and frightened. Alona trying to manage everyone while visibly terrified of him. "Please," Alona said to Maria. "Just take her. I'll be fine." Maria, against her better judgment, led Galina to her apartment 1 floor down. She'd call the building manager from there, maybe the police, definitely someone who could handle whatever was happening in 4C. And then they were alone again, Lance and Alona. The affair that had started with kindness and need had arrived at its inevitable conclusion. 2 people in a broken apartment, police potentially coming, a pregnancy neither wanted the same amount, and a knife in a messenger bag that Lance still told himself he wouldn't use. "Sit," Lance said, pulling out a kitchen chair. "Let's talk like adults." Alona sat because she was calculating constantly now, how to keep him calm, how to get him to leave, how to survive the next hour. She was 14 weeks pregnant with wounds that hadn't fully healed from his last violence and no certainty that talking would save her. But she sat, and they talked, and with every word, the distance between talking and killing got smaller and smaller, until there was no distance at all, just a knife and rage and a bathroom floor that would soon be covered in blood. The hero's mask had fallen completely. What remained was just a man who'd decided that if he couldn't control her, he'd erase her. And in the erasure, he'd finally reveal who he'd been all along. The conversation at the kitchen table lasted 37 minutes, though neither of them would remember it accurately later. Lance would claim he'd been trying to find a peaceful solution. Alona would say she'd been trying to keep him calm until help arrived. The truth was somewhere between their memories, 2 people who'd destroyed each other trying one last time to pretend they could coexist. Lance started with what he thought was reason. "Let's figure out the logistics. The baby, child support, my rights as a father." Alona's laugh was bitter, sharp-edged. "Rights? You threatened to have me deported. You broke into my home. You have no rights. I'm the father. That gives me legal standing. You're married to someone else. You have 2 other children. This baby isn't part of your legal life. It's part of your secret life. And I'm done being your secret." The rejection was total, unambiguous. For months, Lance had operated under the belief that Alona needed him more than he needed her. He was the citizen, the one with status, with legitimacy, with power. She was the undocumented worker, desperate and dependent. But pregnancy had shifted the equation. She had something he couldn't control, his child, his genetic legacy, his potential exposure, and she decided she didn't need his permission or his presence. Lance tried another angle. "How will you afford this? You can't work legally. You can barely afford to live. That's my problem, not yours. I could help, give you money, but you have to agree not to tell anyone about us." Alona looked at him with something approaching pity. "You want to pay me to disappear, to erase the evidence of what you did. I'm trying to help both of us. Why can't you see that? Because your help always comes with conditions, with control, with the threat that if I don't do exactly what you want, you'll destroy me." Her voice was steady now, the fear replaced by clarity. "I spent 6 months believing you loved me, but you don't love anyone except the image of yourself as a hero. And I don't fit that image anymore." The truth of it, the accuracy, the precision, the way she dissected him and found him hollow, ignited something in Lance that had been smoldering since she'd first said she was keeping the baby. It wasn't rage exactly. It was something colder. The recognition that she was right, that he was exactly what she'd described, and that her seeing it meant she had to be eliminated. He reached into his messenger bag without conscious thought, muscle memory taking over where planning had never existed. His hand closed around the knife handle, pulled it out, set it on the table between them. Alona's eyes fixed on the blade. "What is that for?" "Protection." But even as he said it, Lance knew he was lying. Protection from what? From a pregnant woman? From the truth she'd spoken, the knife wasn't protection. It was conclusion. Put it away. Please. I just need you to listen. Really listen. My life is over if you have this baby and tell people it's mine. My marriage, my job, my kids, my reputation, everything I've built, gone. Your life isn't my responsibility anymore. But it was. You said you loved me. You told me that. I was wrong. What I felt wasn't love. It was loneliness mistaking itself for love. The words came out clinical, honest, devastating. You didn't love me either. You just needed someone to make you feel like the hero you pretend to be. Lance stood up. The knife was in his hand now, though he didn't remember picking it up. You're lying. You did love me. Alona stood too, backing toward the door. Maybe I did. But you killed it. Every threat. Every time you made me afraid. Every time you chose your image over my safety. You killed whatever I felt. Where are you going? Away from you. You can't just walk away from me. Watch me. Alona moved toward the door. Lance blocked her path. They stood facing each other in the narrow space between the kitchen and the living room, and the air between them was electric with violence that hadn't happened yet but was inevitable as gravity. Move, Alona said. Not until you understand what you're doing to me. You did this to yourself. Alona tried to push past him. Lance grabbed her arm. The same arm he'd bruised before, the same spot that had never fully healed. She cried out in pain. The sound triggered something in Lance, some last restraint. Breaking, and instead of letting go, he squeezed harder. Alona slapped him. Her palm connected with his face with a crack that echoed in the small apartment. It wasn't a hard slap, wasn't even particularly painful, but it was defiance. It was refusal. It was the final rejection of his authority over her. Lance shoved her. Hard. Alona stumbled backward, her pregnant body off balance, and fell. Her head hit the corner of the kitchen counter on the way down. The sound was sickening, skull on marble, sharp and final. She crumpled to the floor, dazed, blood immediately welling from a gash above her eyebrow. For 3 seconds, Lance stared at what he'd done. Saw Alona on the floor, blood running down her face, hand instinctively moving to protect her stomach. Saw the evidence of his violence made visible. Saw himself clearly for maybe the first time in his life. Not a hero, not a victim, just a man who hurt people and called it love. Oh God, I didn't mean. Are you okay? But Alona was already crawling toward her phone on the counter, leaving blood smears on the tile, breathing hard with pain and terror. Lance saw her reaching for the phone and his brain did its cold calculation. If she calls police now, with visible injuries, with witnesses in the building, his life is over. Prison, divorce, his children's shame, his father's legacy destroyed. The hero of Irongate revealed as just another abuser. The knife was in his hand. He looked at it like it had appeared there by magic, like someone else had put it there. But his fingerprints were on the handle. His hand was clenched around it. His body was moving toward Alona, who was still reaching for her phone, still trying to call for help. Stop, Lance said. Just stop. We can fix this. We can. Alona's fingers closed around the phone. She turned, saw Lance advancing with the knife, and screamed. The sound was primal, wordless. The sound humans make when death approaches and all that's left is to announce your own ending. The first slash caught her hand as she raised it to block. The blade cut across her palm, deep and diagonal, severing tendons. Her phone clattered to the floor. Blood sprayed in an arc across the white kitchen cabinets. Alona scrambled backward, slipping in her own blood, trying to get away, still screaming. Lance followed, not thinking now, just acting, the knife rising and falling. Alona's arms coming up to protect her face, her stomach, her baby. Defensive wounds appearing on her forearms, her hands, her shoulders. She was fighting back, kicking, scratching, trying to grab the knife, but she was pregnant and injured and smaller than him, and the outcome was never in doubt. They crashed into the living room, overturning the coffee table, knocking over the lamp that Galina's late husband had brought from Moscow in 1987. Glass shattered. Blood spread across the worn carpet in patterns that would later be photographed and analyzed and presented to a jury as evidence of struggle. Alona made it to the bathroom, almost got the door closed, but Lance's foot was in the gap, and he pushed through, and the small space that had been Alona's refuge became her trap. She pressed herself against the bathtub, hand over her stomach, trying to protect the baby even though protecting herself was impossible. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't do this. Think of the baby." Lance paused, knife raised, breath coming in gasps, blood on his hands, his shirt, his face. For 1 second, clarity returned. He saw what he was doing, saw Alona curled against the tub, 14 weeks pregnant with his child, bleeding from a dozen wounds, begging for her life. And then he thought, but she'll tell. She'll survive and she'll tell, and I'll be the monster everyone says I am. Better to finish it. Better to make sure. "There is no baby," he said. "Not anymore." The knife came down again, and again, and again, targeting her abdomen with the specific intent to destroy what was inside. Alona stopped fighting after the 4th wound, stopped screaming after the 6th. By the 8th, she was unconscious, body going into shock, bleeding out on the bathroom floor while Lance stood over her with a knife dripping red and a mind that had disconnected from reality completely. He would later claim he didn't remember this part. The lawyers would debate whether dissociation was a defense or just a convenient lie. But in that moment, standing in the bathroom with Alona's blood soaking into his shoes, Lance was somewhere else entirely, watching himself from outside his body, seeing the scene like it was happening to someone else. The sound of a key in the apartment door snapped him back. Galina. She'd convinced Maria she needed something from her apartment, medication, or her favorite blanket, or just the stubborn insistence that comes with dementia. She'd taken Maria's copy of the key and let herself in through the broken door before Maria could stop her. Galina saw the overturned furniture first, then the blood, then Lance emerging from the bathroom, knife in hand, covered in evidence. Their eyes met. Galina's dementia cleared for one perfect moment of lucidity. "Young man," she said, her Russian accent thick with horror. "What have you done?" Lance looked at Galina, 78 years old, 5'2", confused by disease and fragile with age, and did the calculation instantly. Witness, evidence, exposure, everything he'd been trying to prevent since this whole disaster started. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it in the same way he'd meant everything else, sincerely in the moment without any impact on his actions. Galina tried to run, turned toward the door, moved with the painful slowness of elderly joints and dementia-confused coordination. Lance caught her before she made it 3 steps. The killing was faster this time, more efficient, for stab wounds, chest, abdomen, back, neck. Galina collapsed on her living room floor, hand reaching toward the medical alert pendant she wore around her neck, trying to press the button that would summon help. Lance ripped the pendant off, threw it across the room, watched Galina's eyes glaze over, watched her body go still, watched another life end because he couldn't bear the consequences of his choices. He stood in the center of the apartment, 2 women bleeding, one definitely dead, one probably dying, blood on every surface, his fingerprints on the knife, his DNA under Alona's fingernails where she'd scratched him, his wallet, he'd realized later, kicked under the couch during the struggle. Sirens in the distance. Maria had called 911 when Galina had insisted on entering the apartment. Police were coming, maybe 5 minutes away, maybe less. Lance ran, dropped the knife on the bathroom floor, grabbed his messenger bag, took the back stairwell, exited through the service entrance, made it to his car before remembering it would be on security cameras, started walking instead, got 3 blocks before the adrenaline crash hit and he vomited in an alley. Inside apartment 4C, Alona lay in the bathroom, barely breathing. 11 stab wounds, 3 to the abdomen that had destroyed the pregnancy. Defensive wounds on both arms. A gash on her head from hitting the counter. Blood loss approaching the fatal threshold. But alive. Impossibly, miraculously, stubbornly alive. When the first responders arrived at 2:47 p.m., they found Galina first, obviously deceased. Then followed the blood trail to the bathroom and found Alona. Officer Chan, a 15-year veteran who'd worked homicides and thought nothing could shock him anymore, took one look at the scene and had to step outside to compose himself. The paramedics worked on Alona for 11 minutes before they could safely move her. She was unconscious, but her lips were moving, whispering something the paramedics couldn't quite hear. One of them leaned close, ear near her mouth, and heard, "Lance O'Connor. He did this." They loaded her into the ambulance, rushed her to Irongate General Hospital, called ahead for a trauma surgeon. gave her a 20% chance of surviving the next hour. The baby was already gone, miscarried in the violence, another casualty of Lance's need for control. Detective Sarah Martinez arrived at the scene at 3:15 p.m. She was 42, had worked Brooklyn homicides for 15 years, and had developed an instinct for reading crime scenes that bordered on supernatural. She walked through apartment 4C slowly, methodically, taking in every detail. The broken door, the overturned furniture, the blood patterns that showed movement from kitchen to living room to bathroom, the knife on the bathroom floor, fingerprints visible even without processing, the wallet under the couch with Lance O'Connor's ID and FDNY badge inside. Martinez picked up the badge with gloved hands, looked at the photo. "Read the name. Firefighter," she said to Officer Chun. "The hero from last year. The building fire. Has to be a mistake," Chun said. "Maybe he was here earlier. Maybe someone stole his wallet." Martinez looked at the blood evidence, the struggle patterns, the defensive wounds, the rage written in every surface. No mistake. He was here for this. They found Lance's phone number through the wallet, called it, voicemail, called his home. Meredith answered on the third ring, voice already worried because Lance had been gone all day, and she'd seen the news alerts about a stabbing in Irongate. "Mrs. O'Connor, this is Detective Martinez with the NYPD. Is your husband home?" "No. He left this morning. Said he was going to a meeting. He hasn't come back. Is he hurt? We need to speak with him regarding an incident. When he returns, please have him call this number immediately." Martinez heard the shift in Meredith's breathing. The recognition that this call wasn't about Lance being hurt. It was about Lance hurting someone. What did he do? Meredith's voice was small, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it anyway. "We just need to speak with him, ma'am." But they both knew. The pretending was over. The hero was a killer, and his wife had probably known something was broken long before the police made it official. By 5 p.m., Lance's photo was on every news channel. Hero firefighter wanted in double homicide. The story went viral within hours. Lance O'Connor, who'd saved 4 people from a burning building, who'd been celebrated and commended and held up as everything a man should be, was now a fugitive covered in the blood of 2 women, one of whom had been pregnant with his child. Lance, meanwhile, had found refuge in an abandoned textile mill on the edge of Irongate. He'd broken in through a busted window, climbed to the 2nd floor, and hidden in an old office that still had a desk and a chair and windows overlooking the neighborhood where he'd been a hero yesterday and would be a monster forever after today. He sat in that office for 16 hours. No phone, no water, no escape plan, just sitting in the dark, replaying the day, trying to find the moment where he could have made a different choice. But every alternate timeline led back to the same place. He'd been willing to kill Alona rather than accept the consequences of his actions. That willingness didn't appear in the moment. It had been building for months, maybe years, maybe his whole life. At 4 a.m. on September 16th, Lance walked to a payphone, dialed 911, told them his name and location, said he was unarmed and wanted to surrender. The dispatcher kept him on the line while units responded. Lance stood outside the textile mill, hands visible, waiting for the end of his freedom and the beginning of his accountability. 6 police cars arrived, guns drawn, officers shouting commands. Lance followed every instruction perfectly, got on his knees, hands behind his head, face down on the ground, felt the handcuffs close around his wrists with a click that sounded like a door closing on his old life forever. "Lance O'Connor, you're under arrest for murder and attempted murder." "I know," Lance said. And then, because some part of him still believed he was the victim in all of this, "Can someone check on my kids?" Act 6, Justice and Reflection. Alona woke up 4 days after the attack in the ICU at Irongate General Hospital, restrained to the bed with soft cuffs because she tried to pull out her breathing tube twice while unconscious. The first thing she saw was Maricel's face hovering above her, eyes red from crying, rosary beads wrapped around her fingers. "You're awake. Oh, thank God, you're awake." Alona tried to speak but couldn't around the tube, tried to sit up but couldn't move. Her body was a map of pain, every nerve ending reporting damage. Maricel pressed the call button, and within seconds, nurses and doctors flooded the room. They removed the breathing tube. Alona's first words were, "Galena." The doctor's face told her everything before the words came. "I'm so sorry. She didn't make it. Alona screamed. Not from physical pain, though there was plenty of that. From grief and guilt and the knowledge that Galina had died because of her. Because Lance had been there for her. Because Alona's choices had killed an innocent woman whose only crime was being in her own apartment. And the baby? Alona whispered, though she already knew. Could feel the emptiness. Could sense the absence. I'm sorry. The trauma was too severe. There was nothing we could do. Alona turned her face to the wall and cried for 2 hours straight. For Galina. For her baby. For the version of herself that had died on that bathroom floor. The nurses let her cry, understanding that some pain needs to be released before healing can begin. Detective Martinez visited on the 5th day. Brought a victim advocate and a Tagalog translator. Though Alona's English was fine. Martinez was gentle but thorough, taking Alona's statement over 3 hours, recording every detail of the affair. The threats, the violence, the attack. Will you testify? Martinez asked when they were done. Yes, he needs to pay for what he did. I need to tell you something. Immigration and Customs Enforcement knows about your status. They have a detainer request. Alona's heart sank. So after I testify, I get deported? Not necessarily. We're working on getting you a U visa. It's for crime victims who cooperate with law enforcement. It would give you temporary legal status and a path to residency. How long? Could be months. Could be a year. But you're protected while the case is pending. No one's deporting a witness in a murder trial. The Filipino community in Irongate mobilized in ways Alona had never experienced. They started a fundraiser that raised $180,000 in 2 weeks, paid her hospital bills, set up a trust fund for her recovery. Our Lady of Perpetual Hope organized meals, visits, prayer vigils. Alona, who'd spent 5 years invisible, suddenly found herself surrounded by a community that saw her clearly and refused to let her disappear. Maricel brought her to live in her apartment after she was discharged. Physical therapy 3 times a week for the knife wounds that had damaged tendons and nerves. Counseling twice a week for the PTSD that made sleep impossible and mirrors unbearable. Slowly, painfully, Alona began rebuilding herself from the ruins Lance had left. The media coverage was relentless and divided. Half the stories portrayed Lance as a fallen hero, a good man who'd snapped under pressure. The other half portrayed him as a predator who'd hidden behind his uniform. Comment sections became battlegrounds. She was illegal and having an affair with a married man. She's not innocent. He murdered a 78-year-old woman with dementia. There's no excuse for that. His whole life is ruined because of one mistake. Stabbing someone 11 times isn't a mistake. It's attempted murder. Lance's defense attorney, Thomas Brennan, was expensive and media-savvy. He immediately began crafting a narrative, temporary insanity, crime of passion, a hero broken by PTSD and alcohol. Lance wasn't a monster. He was a victim of his own trauma, of Alona's manipulation, of circumstances that spiraled out of control. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rachel Kim, saw it differently. This was premeditated murder. Lance had brought a knife, had broken into the apartment, had attacked a pregnant woman and killed a witness. The temporary insanity defense was just a way to excuse the inexcusable. The trial began on April 8, 2024, 7 months after the murders. The courthouse was surrounded by protesters representing every possible position. Justice for Alona supporters holding signs. Thin Blue Line supporters claiming Lance was being railroaded. Immigrant rights activists. Domestic violence advocates. True crime podcasters recording episodes in real time. Jury selection took 3 weeks. Both sides rejected anyone with strong opinions about police, firefighters, immigration, or domestic violence, which eliminated about 90% of the potential pool. They finally seated 12 jurors who claimed they could be impartial, though impartiality about a case this publicized was aspirational at best. Opening statements laid out competing realities. Prosecutor Kim painted Lance as a controlling abuser who'd systematically isolated and terrorized Alona, then killed her and Galina to cover his tracks. Defense attorney Brennan portrayed him as a decorated firefighter with undiagnosed PTSD, who'd suffered a psychotic break triggered by Alona's provocations. Ladies and gentlemen, Lance O'Connor saved 4 lives, Brennan said in his opening. He ran into burning buildings while others ran out. He's a hero who made a tragic, terrible mistake in a moment of mental illness. This is not a man who planned to kill. This is a man who broke. Kim's rebuttal was surgical. The defendant wants you to see his uniform and forget his actions. He wants you to believe that saving strangers excuses stabbing a pregnant woman 11 times. That's not justice. That's hero worship replacing accountability. The prosecution's case took 3 weeks. Text messages showing months of escalating threats. Photos of Alona's bruises from previous incidents. Maria's testimony about hearing the attack. Forensic evidence connecting Lance to every aspect of the crime scene. Medical testimony about Alona's injuries and the lost pregnancy. And then Alona herself took the stand. She walked to the witness box slowly, visibly limping from injuries that had partially healed but would never fully disappear. She wore long sleeves to cover the scars on her arms, but everyone in the courtroom knew they were there. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and spent 6 hours over 2 days telling the complete story. The affair, the pregnancy, the threats, the escalation, the attack. She was calm, factual, heartbreaking. Defense attorney Brennan tried to rattle her on cross-examination, implying she'd seduced Lance, trapped him with pregnancy, provoked him with insults. You called him pathetic, didn't you? You said his father would be ashamed of him? Yes, I was angry and scared and said something cruel. And nothing I said justifies what he did to me or to Galina. But you admit you provoked him? I admit I hurt his feelings. He responded by trying to kill me. Those aren't equivalent. Brennan tried another angle. You were in the country illegally. You were working under the table. You were having an affair with a married man. You're not exactly a model citizen. Alona met his eyes steadily. I never claimed to be perfect. I made mistakes. I broke laws. I hurt people, but I didn't kill anyone. Lance did, and no amount of my imperfection excuses his violence. The jury was visibly moved. Several were crying. Even the judge looked shaken. The defense case lasted 1 week. Psychiatrists testified about PTSD, dissociation, temporary insanity. Character witnesses described Lance as a devoted father, dedicated firefighter, pillar of the community. His captain testified about Lance's exemplary service record. His mother cried on the stand describing how proud his father would have been. And then Lance himself testified. Against his lawyer's advice, he took the stand because he needed people to hear his side, to understand he wasn't a monster, to know that he was suffering too. I loved her, Lance said, tears streaming down his face. I never meant to hurt her. I was trying to protect my family, my kids, my life, and everything just spiraled. I don't even remember most of what happened. It's like I was watching someone else do these things. Prosecutor Kim's cross-examination was brutal. You loved her, so you stabbed her 11 times? I wasn't in my right mind. You were in your right mind enough to bring a knife. That was for protection. Protection from a pregnant woman and a 78-year-old with dementia? I wasn't thinking clearly, but you were thinking clearly enough to flee the scene. To hide for 16 hours, to avoid cameras. That requires planning. That requires consciousness. That requires knowing what you did was wrong. Lance had no answer. The jury saw it. The gallery saw it. The livestream viewers saw it. Lance O'Connor's defense died in real time. Closing arguments took 1 day. Defense claimed temporary insanity. Prosecution claimed premeditated murder. The jury deliberated for 4 days. Some initially sympathized with the fallen hero narrative, but the evidence was overwhelming. The text messages, the threats, the broken door, the knife, 11 stab wounds, a murdered elderly woman who'd only witnessed the crime. On June 20, 2024, the jury returned their verdict. Count 1, murder in the first degree, Galina Volkov, guilty. Count 2, attempted murder in the first degree, Alona de Vera, guilty. Additional charges, breaking and entering, assault, destruction of evidence, guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Lance's mother collapsed. Meredith, sitting in the back row, showed no emotion at all. She'd grieved the loss of her husband months ago, and this verdict was just paperwork confirming what she already knew. Alona, sitting with Maricel, felt nothing except exhaustion. Justice felt less like victory and more like the official acknowledgement that everything she'd lost was real. Sentencing came 2 months later. The judge, a 63-year-old woman who'd presided over hundreds of violent crime cases, looked at Lance with something approaching sadness. "Mr. O'Connor, you betrayed everything your uniform represents. You used your position to manipulate a vulnerable woman. You threatened her with deportation when she wouldn't comply with your demands. You broke into her home. You attempted to murder her and her unborn child. And when an innocent elderly woman witnessed your crime, you killed her to silence her. Your uniform doesn't excuse these actions. Your service record doesn't erase these crimes. Your tears don't resurrect the dead or heal the traumatized. Life without parole for first-degree murder. 25 years for attempted murder. Sentences to run consecutively. Lance O'Connor would die in prison. The hero of Iron Gate would spend the rest of his life in a cell, and everyone who'd worshipped him would have to reckon with how completely they'd been fooled. 2 years later, Alona's U-Visa was approved. She had legal status for the first time in 7 years. She was working at a Filipino community center, helping other immigrant women navigate the systems that had nearly destroyed her. She still limped, still had nightmares, still couldn't be in enclosed spaces without panic attacks. But she was alive, building something new from the ruins of what Lance had tried to erase. Galena's daughter, Patricia, used the settlement money from the wrongful death lawsuit to create a scholarship fund for immigrant caregivers pursuing nursing degrees. 70 students had received funding so far. Galena's name was attached to education, to opportunity, to the kind of legacy that actually mattered. Lance's children, Connor and Emma, had changed their last names to their mother's maiden name. They'd moved to a different state. They were in therapy trying to understand how their father, the man who coached their baseball teams and tucked them in at night, was also a murderer. Meredith had filed for divorce the day after the verdict. She never spoke to Lance again. The Iron Gate Fire Department removed Lance's name from every honor roll, every plaque, every photo wall. They implemented new protocols for mental health screening and domestic violence training. Captain Rodriguez retired early, unable to reconcile how he'd missed every warning sign. The case became a teaching tool. Law schools studied it for domestic violence patterns. Immigration advocates cited it when lobbying for stronger protections for undocumented crime victims. Psychologists wrote papers about hero complex pathology and narcissistic violence. And in a maximum security prison 3 hours north of New York City, Lance O'Connor sat in his cell, writing letters to his children that were returned unopened. He'd been attacked twice by other inmates. Cops and firefighters weren't popular in prison, and spent most of his time in protective custody, alone with his thoughts and his regrets and the recognition that came too late to matter. In a victim impact statement that was later published widely, Alona wrote, "People ask me if I forgive him. I don't know how to answer that. Forgiveness feels like something I owe him, and I owe him nothing. He took my baby. He took Galena. He took my sense of safety and my ability to trust. He took years of my life and left me with scars I'll carry forever. But he didn't take my voice. I speak now for everyone who can't. For the women who died at the hands of men who claimed to love them. For the immigrants who are afraid to ask for help. For anyone who believes the uniform makes the hero. Doesn't. Character does. Choices do. Lance O'Connor chose violence every single time. And now he'll die in prison, forgotten by everyone except the people he destroyed. That's not forgiveness, but it's justice. And sometimes justice is the best we can hope for." The hero's mask had shattered completely, revealing the monster it had always hidden. And in the debris of Lance O'Connor's destroyed life, Alona de Vera was doing something he'd never given her credit for: surviving, healing, and making sure that what happened to her would help protect the next woman who trusted the wrong hero. The uniform didn't make Lance O'Connor. His choices did. And his choices made him a killer. That's the only truth that mattered.